Water is falling from the sky. It has been falling for 14 days. The ground beneath your feet has turned into a freezing gray paste. You are cold. For modern people, rain is a minor annoyance. You grab an umbrella before you leave the house. You step quickly into a completely dry vehicle. You complain to your friends about the muddy streets. But what happens when there is no door to close against the storm? For hundreds of thousands of years, your ancestors lived entirely exposed to the raw elements of a brutal planet. They could not simply step inside a heated building. The rain became their entire encompassing world. How long can the human body actually survive when absolutely everything is endlessly wet? Your skin begins to change almost immediately upon continuous exposure. The constant flowing water strips away your natural protective oils. The vital outer layer of your epidermis swells with absorbed moisture. It weakens significantly with every passing hour. It becomes incredibly vulnerable to deep and dangerous infections. Today, medical professionals call this specific condition immersion foot or trench foot. It happens when feet are kept wet and cold for prolonged and uninterrupted periods. This relentless exposure causes rapid and aggressive tissue decay. The blood vessels in your legs and feet constrict violently to save your core heat. The essential tissue in your extremities literally begins to die from a lack of oxygen. Without modern synthetic antibiotics, a simple fungal infection in the damp wilderness can become a terribly slow death sentence. You must desperately find a way to stay dry. Where do you possibly go when the entire physical landscape is completely saturated with freezing water? You look desperately for deep and stable rock shelters. You seek out massive natural caves hidden in the limestone cliffs. You crawl cautiously under the dense woven canopies of ancient old-growth forests. But finding a temporary physical shelter is only your very first problem. The stagnant air inside a cave during a solid month of rain is incredibly heavy and thick. The pervasive humidity traps the ambient cold directly against your bare, shivering skin. You desperately need to build a fire to dry your body. Have you ever actually tried to start a fire with soaking wet wood in near total darkness? It is nearly a biological and physical impossibility. The ancient and primitive friction methods require completely dry fibrous materials to generate a single viable ember. The delicate glowing sparks from striking two pieces of flint die instantly on the damp and rotting tinder. Archaeologist Dennis Sandgaith from Simon Fraser University studied this exact prehistoric problem in ancient Europe. He thoroughly excavated massive prehistoric sites like Roc de Marseille in the river valleys of France. He wanted to deeply understand ancient hominin survival during extreme and punishing weather events. He looked specifically and intensely at Neanderthal fire use during wildly different ancient climate periods. His dedicated research team discovered something completely unexpected hidden deeply in the ancient soil layers. During the absolute coldest and wettest glacial periods, Neanderthal fire use actually decreased rather than increased. They simply could not keep their crucial fires burning when the entire world turned into a frozen and flooded swamp. They had to survive the freezing and terrifying dark entirely without the comfort of flames. How do you possibly survive a freezing wet month in the absolute dark without a reliable heat source? You rely entirely and completely on your immediate community. You violently share body heat by sleeping incredibly closely together in a tight huddle. You heavily consume highly concentrated animal fats to keep your fragile internal temperature from completely crashing. Your exhausted body enters a unique biological state of extreme endurance and preservation. Your internal metabolism shifts drastically. It burns massive and unsustainable amounts of calories just to maintain a constant shivering state. You desperately and continuously need fresh food. But hunting wild game in endless torrential rain is a completely miserable and dangerous nightmare. The heavy falling water completely washes away all distinct animal tracks in the thick and slippery mud. The deafening roaring sound of the massive storm completely masks the stealthy approach of large and dangerous apex predators. Your carefully carved wooden hunting spears become heavily waterlogged and entirely unbalanced. The persistent soaking dampness slowly loosens the dried animal sinew bindings on your sharp stone tools. Everything you rely on for basic survival slowly and methodically falls apart in your hands. Why is constant environmental moisture the absolute greatest enemy of ancient human food preservation? Because raw meat rots incredibly aggressively in high humidity environments. The carefully gathered nuts and starchy roots begin to aggressively mold before you can safely eat them. You are completely surrounded by falling water, but you are slowly and inevitably starving to death. This is exactly the brutal crucible where human ingenuity was violently forced to evolve. Survival required incredibly deep environmental knowledge and an intimate understanding of the local landscape. It required precise and intentional chemical control of your immediate physical surroundings. Archaeologist Lynn Wadley famously excavated a massive and highly significant site called Sibutu Cave in South Africa. The sprawling site contains massive amounts of continuous evidence of complex human occupation. This irrefutable evidence dates back to exactly 77,000 years ago. Wadley found something truly remarkable and unprecedented in the ancient compacted dirt layers of the cave floor. She discovered the absolute earliest known physical evidence of intentionally constructed human bedding. Your intelligent ancestors did not just simply sleep on the damp and freezing cave floor. They actively built elevated sleeping mats out of very specific and highly beneficial local plants. They actively and intentionally sought out the broad green leaves of the Cryptocarya woodii tree. This specific indigenous plant contains powerful and highly effective natural chemical compounds. These complex botanical compounds actively and aggressively repel dangerous, biting insects. They carefully layered these protective medicinal leaves over thick beds of deliberately compacted white fire ash. The dry ash naturally and effectively absorbed the ambient moisture from the heavy cave air. It kept the communal sleeping area completely dry and remarkably sanitary for extended periods. Why is this intense and deliberate level of environmental preparation so absolutely critical for long-term survival? Because endless standing rain always brings endless swarms of dangerous and parasitic pests. Millions of mosquitoes breed rapidly in the stagnant pools of muddy water just outside the cave entrance. Thousands of ticks and fleas desperately seek refuge from the relentless rain in the exact same dry spaces that you do. The damp and warm darkness is a completely perfect breeding ground for disease-carrying and blood-sucking parasites. By actively controlling their immediate microenvironment, your ancestors cleverly fought back against the invading swarms. They fought effectively against the completely invisible and deadly threats of the long wet season. But there is another terrible and insidious threat completely hidden in the endless rain. It is not a physical or biological threat at all. It is entirely and deeply psychological in its destructive nature. Imagine sitting completely trapped in a dimly lit rock shelter for 3 straight agonizing weeks. You are packed incredibly tightly with 20 other highly frustrated and restless people. You are constantly hungry and your stomach aches with deep and sharp pains. Your bones ache deeply and persistently from the relentless and biting cold air. The heavy and offensive smell of damp animal fur and unwashed human bodies completely fills the stagnant cave air. The violent sound of the driving rain is a constant and truly deafening roar just outside the cave mouth. How do you possibly keep from completely losing your mind in the claustrophobic dark? Modern humans commonly call this incredibly uncomfortable feeling cabin fever. The absolute and total lack of natural bright sunlight heavily disrupts your internal circadian rhythm and sleep cycles. The intense and inescapable physical confinement breeds severe mental anxiety. It breeds sudden and completely unpredictable spikes of violent aggression among the group members. Dr. Penny Spikins at the prestigious University of York deeply researches the emotional and psychological evolution of early human species. She strongly suggests that biological survival in these harsh ancient environments required profound and masterful emotional regulation. It required deep and incredibly active empathy for your fellow struggling group members. You absolutely could not survive the endless freezing monsoons without extreme and practiced social tolerance. You had to intentionally learn to quickly suppress sudden flashes of irrational anger. You had to completely master the difficult and essential art of extreme social patience. The relentless rain literally forced early nomadic humans to sit completely still together in the dark. It actively forced them to communicate with each other simply to pass the endless empty time. It effectively created the absolutely perfect captive social environment for the vital evolution of human storytelling. What do you actually do when you cannot hunt and you absolutely cannot gather food? You can only sit together and share valuable learned information. You tell complex and highly detailed stories about past successful hunts to properly teach the young children. You carefully pass down critical geographic knowledge about distant and unseen landscapes. Anthropologist Polly Wiesner spent decades studying modern hunter-gatherer societies in the Kalahari. She extensively documented how firelight and dark confinement naturally shape human conversations. During the bright daylight hours, humans talk primarily about practical economic matters and immediate survival tasks. But when trapped together in the dim light of a camp or cave, the conversation shifts completely. It shifts toward complex mythologies and deep emotional bonding. The endless and miserable wet season acted as a massive evolutionary pressure cooker for complex human language. It acted as a powerful pressure cooker for the development of early shared culture. The physical trap of the wet and dark cave actually liberated the expansive human mind. Your ancestors were forced to invent entire imaginary worlds just to survive the agonizing boredom of the actual world. This enforced collective imagination eventually led directly to massive cultural explosions. Look at the astonishing cave paintings found deep inside Chauvet Cave in southern France. These breathtaking works of ancient art were created in the deep and silent dark. They were painted by people who spent massive amounts of time seeking shelter from harsh external environments. The intense focus required to paint massive lions and rhinos on stone walls implies a massive surplus of indoor time. The endless freezing rain was not just a terrible physical threat to be endured. It was the ultimate and completely necessary catalyst for the invention of human indoor technology. If the ancient global weather had always been perfectly warm and perfectly clear, we might never have learned to build. We might never have been forced to develop complex residential architecture to stay dry. We might never have been forced to develop artificial lighting to combat the endless dark. The burning and driving desire to strictly control our immediate environment was born directly from this trauma. It was born from the trauma of being completely and utterly vulnerable to the falling sky. Our modern obsession with creating perfectly climate-controlled rooms is a direct evolutionary response to ancient suffering. We are constantly trying to banish the damp and freezing conditions that tormented our ancestors for millennia. Think very deeply about this the next time you turn on a heavy rain soundscape to help you fall asleep. Millions of perfectly safe people today use the artificial digital sound of a massive thunderstorm to relax their tired minds. Your modern brain actually finds incredibly deep and profound comfort in the rhythmic sound of rain beating heavily against the roof. Why does an ancient and terrifying survival threat now inexplicably make you feel so incredibly safe and warm? Because the distinct sound of rain hitting a solid and impenetrable barrier heavily signals that you have finally won the ancient war. It explicitly tells your ancient and highly evolved nervous system that you have successfully separated yourself from the harsh and deadly elements. You are finally inside a safe space. You are completely dry. You are completely safe from the terrible dampness. But your biological body still deeply remembers the terrible and biting cold. Your living genetics still permanently carry the highly invisible adaptations forced and forged in those damp ancient caves. Water is endlessly falling from the sky, but you are finally completely safe from the freezing gray paste.